What if the life you worked so hard for isn't what you want anymore? Welcome back to Beyond the Surface. I'm Sarah Whyte, and today I want to talk about something I've been thinking about a lot lately because I think there comes a point in many of our lives when we have to confront a really uncomfortable truth. What happens when the life you worked so hard to create isn't necessarily the life you want anymore? Maybe it's your career. Maybe it's a business you've spent years building. Maybe it's a relationship where you live, a goal you've been chasing, or simply a version of your life that made complete sense 5 or 10 years ago, but doesn't feel the same anymore. I think we're given a lot of permission to want more in life. We're encouraged to dream bigger, set goals, work harder, keep going, don't give up. We're taught how to pursue something, how to build it, and how to keep pushing when it gets difficult. But we're not given nearly as much permission to get somewhere and say, I don't think I want this anymore. And that's a very different conversation. I've been having versions of this conversation with myself in my own life. There are things I've built that required years of my time, energy, sacrifice, commitment, and honestly, a lot of myself. There were times when I wanted those things so badly, I worked incredibly hard for them, and I'm proud of what I was able to create. But there's something strange about reaching a point where you realize that being capable of continuing something doesn't necessarily mean you want to continue it. You can be really good at something and not want to do it anymore. I think that's important because sometimes we assume that if something isn't completely falling apart, we don't have a good enough reason to change it. We think there needs to be some dramatic event that gives us permission to walk away. But sometimes nothing dramatic happens. Sometimes we've simply changed. The person who wanted this 5 or 10 years ago isn't exactly the same person sitting here today. You've lived more, you've experienced things you couldn't have anticipated. Your priorities have changed. You've learned what something actually feels like to live inside of rather than what you imagined it would feel like when you were working toward it. And sometimes you discover that something can look really good from the outside and still not feel right anymore when you're the person actually living it. I think that realization can bring up a tremendous amount of anxiety because the minute you admit you might want something different, your mind wants to know where you're going to do about it. If I don't want this, then what do I want? And that's usually where things get complicated. We don't just think about what we want. We start thinking about everything connected to changing it. The time we've invested, the money, the people involved, the responsibilities, what other people are going to think, whether we're making a mistake or whether we're going to regret it. Suddenly, one realization about your life turns into your brain trying to solve the next 5 years. And I've experienced this myself. I can recognize that something needs to change and almost immediately feel like I need to know exactly what I'm going to replace it with. I want to see the next path before I leave the one I'm on. There's something about having a plan that makes change feel safer. But life doesn't always give us that. Sometimes you know something isn't right anymore before you know exactly what is. And I think that space between those two things is where a lot of us struggle. When familiar starts feeling safer than fulfilled. One of the things I've realized is that we can stay in situations for a very long time simply because we understand them. We know how they work. We know what's expected of us. We know how to perform inside of them. And when you've been doing something for years, there's always an identity that gets attached to it. Other people begin to know you for that thing, but more importantly, you begin to know yourself through it too. That's why changing direction can feel so much bigger than changing a job, closing a business, moving somewhere new, or ending a chapter. Sometimes it feels like you're changing who you are, and that can be incredibly uncomfortable. I think this is especially true for women who have spent years achieving, building, accomplishing, and being the person everyone else can depend on. There can be this underlying belief that if we're capable of doing something, we should keep doing it. But capability isn't the same thing as desire. And success isn't always continuing something simply because you know how. Sometimes success is being willing to admit that the definition you had for your life no longer fits the person you are now. That doesn't erase everything you did to get here. It doesn't mean those years were wasted. It doesn't mean you made the wrong choice. Maybe that chapter gave you exactly what you needed from it. Maybe it taught you something about yourself you couldn't have learned any other way. And maybe you had to live that life to discover what you want from this one. Changing your mind doesn't mean you are wrong. I think this is something we need to give ourselves more permission around. You are allowed to change your mind. There are decisions I made years ago that were absolutely right for the woman I was at that time. I wouldn't necessarily make all of those same decisions today. That doesn't make the earlier version of me wrong. She had different information, she wanted different things, and she was building a different life. And I think sometimes we stay loyal to old decisions because changing them feels like admitting we made a mistake. But growth would be pretty meaningless if we were expected to want exactly the same things forever. You should know yourself differently at 40 than you did at 25. You should have more knowledge, more wisdom. You should have experienced things that changed your perspective. And sometimes one of the things that changes is the definition of success. There was a time in my life when achievement itself was incredibly important to me, and building something mattered. Proving that I could do it mattered, and reaching the next level mattered. And some of those things still matter to me, but other things matter much more than they used to. How I spend my days matter. Who I spend them with matters. And having room in my life for the things I love matter. Actually enjoying what I'm building really matters. Because at some point, I think we have to ask ourselves whether we're creating a life that looks successful or one we actually want to live. That's one of the questions worth sitting with. So, why change can make us so anxious? This is where I want to talk about anxiety because I think it plays a much bigger role in these decisions than we sometimes realize. You can know that you want something to change and still feel incredibly anxious about changing it. Our bodies respond to uncertainty. The familiar may not be fulfilling anymore, but it's known. You understand it. Your brain has years of evidence about what happens there. The new thing doesn't have that history yet. So when you start imagining leaving something familiar, your mind can immediately start generating everything that could be wrong. That's when we start bargaining with ourselves. Maybe I should just keep doing this. Maybe I need to give it another year. Maybe I'm being ungrateful. Or maybe I'm just tired. And maybe the next thing will be worse. And to be clear, sometimes we are just tired. Not every difficult season means you need to blow up your life. Sometimes you need a break. Sometimes you need support. Sometimes you need a boundary. And sometimes the thing itself doesn't need to end, but the way you're doing it needs to change. But there are also times when, underneath all of the fear and all of the reasons why you should keep going, you know something has changed. And maybe the first step isn't making some enormous decision. Maybe the first step is simply being willing to tell yourself the truth. I don't want this in the same way anymore. You can acknowledge that without having the entire solution. You don't need the replacement before you let yourself feel the truth. This has probably been one of the hardest lessons for me because I love knowing what comes next. If something is ending, I would really prefer the universe to hand me a beautifully organized folder explaining exactly what's replacing it, how it's going to work, what it's going to make, and confirmation that I've made the correct decision. Unfortunately, that has not been my experience. Sometimes you get clarity about what you don't want before you have clarity about what you do want. And that in between can make us anxious because we interrupt not knowing as a problem and we need to solve immediately. But maybe you don't. Maybe you don't have to turn one realization into 10 decisions by tomorrow morning. You can recognize that something needs to change and give yourself time to understand what that change actually looks like. And this is where I found nervous system work to be so important because I don't want the most anxious version of me making every major decision in my life. When my body is activated and my mind is trying to predict every possible outcome, everything feels more urgent than it actually is. Sometimes I need to work with my body first. I need to move. I need to breathe. I need to go outside. I need to do something that brings me back into the moment I'm actually living. Then I can look at the situation again. The goal isn't to wait until you're completely fearless before you change something. If we did that, most of us would probably never change anything. It's creating enough space between the fear and the decision that you can hear yourself again. You are allowed to redefine what success looks like. I think one of the most freeing things we can do as we move through different seasons of our lives is allow our definition of success to evolve with us. Maybe success used to mean building the biggest thing you possibly could. Or maybe now it means building something you actually enjoy. Maybe it used to mean making more money, but now you still want financial success, but you also want more of your time back. Maybe it used to mean proving that you could do something, and maybe you don't need to prove that anymore. There isn't one definition you're required to use for the rest of your life. And changing your definition doesn't diminish what you've already accomplished. You get to bring all of that experience with you. That's the part I think we sometimes forget when we're afraid of starting something new. You're not starting from zero. You're starting with everything you know now that you didn't know then. You're bringing the lessons, the experiences, the relationships, the mistakes, and the confidence, and a much clearer understanding of what you're willing and unwilling to give your life to. There's a very different starting point. Maybe you don't need to change everything. I also want to say this because I don't want this conversation to sound like an invitation to quit your job tomorrow, end your relationship, close your business, sell your house, and completely reinvent your life by Friday. That's not what I'm saying. Sometimes when we realize something doesn't feel right, our minds go immediately to the most extreme version of change. But change can be much smaller. Maybe you need to have a conversation you've been avoiding. Maybe you need to stop saying yes to something. Maybe you need to change the way your business operates. Maybe you need more help. Maybe you need more time for yourself. Or maybe eventually you do realize a chapter is complete. You don't have to know which one it is today. You can give yourself permission to explore the truth before deciding what you're going to do with it. And maybe there's only one question you need to sit with right now. Do I still want this? Don't immediately turn it into a plan. Just notice the answer. If you're listening to this and you're somewhere in that space right now where you know something feels different, but you don't completely know what comes next, I want you to remember that anxiety doesn't automatically mean you're making the wrong decision. Sometimes your body is responding to the fact that you're considering something unfamiliar. And that's also why I created the Nervous System Reset Vault, because these are the moments when I think it's incredibly helpful to have something you can actually do with the anxiety rather than spending another hour thinking about it. Inside the vault, I created simple body-based practices for the moments when you're anxious, overwhelmed, stressed, or caught in overthinking. They're practices you can use to work with your body first so that you can come back to the situation with a little more space. If that feels supportive for where you are right now, I've linked the Nervous System Reset Vault for you in the show notes. And then I want you to come back to that one question. Do I still want this? Maybe your answer is absolutely yes. Maybe it's no. And maybe it's I don't know yet. All three answers tell you something. You don't have to change your entire life today. But I do think there's something powerful about being willing to acknowledge when you've changed. The life you worked incredibly hard to create may have been exactly the life you needed for that chapter. And if you want something different now, that doesn't erase what came before. Maybe it simply means you're ready to write something new. And thank you for spending this time with me on Beyond the Surface. If this conversation made you think of someone in your life who's questioning what they want next, send this episode to them. And if you're enjoying these conversations, follow Beyond the Surface so the next episode is waiting for you when it drops. See you in the next episode.